This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Baglin.
When the NBA lost Michael Jordan, they lost the best. When baseball lost Pete Rose, they lost the best. If tennis lost anyone, yes, Martina Navratilova. When she left the game, they lost a dominating player. When the Eastern Forests lost the American Chestnut tree, down went the king. But it's poised for a comeback. Try that, Jack Nicklaus. Details ahead as we go inside outdoors on Kentucky Afield Radio.
In a unit, many function as one. What's the policy on your boat?
Michael Noss, Navy SEAL.
Your attitude toward wearing a life jacket, even if you know how to swim, will prompt others to do the same. Be alert, be a leader. Injury, choking, and worse can happen when a wave sends you and your craft in opposite directions. And just hope your life jacket isn't missing in action. That's training you can trust.
Kentucky Fish and Wildlife reminds you your life jacket's got your back and the backing of the best swimmers everywhere.
At the absolute worst, it was a little white lie.
A little white lie.
After all, when it hit the line, it felt like a 15-pounder. It doesn't matter what the scale says. So it might be an ever so slight deviation from the truth.
Sometimes in fishing, the truth is hard to catch.
Maybe just a stretch.
But the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife reminds you, fishing isn't about math. It's about fun.
And fudging a little if you need to.
Kentucky Fishing.
It'll make a liar out of you.
You are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. I am Charlie Baglin, and I am joined on the phone by Scott Freidhof. Scott is a public lands wildlife biologist in forest management. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it, Scott? You're in the northeast region of the state. Where are you?
Well, Charlie, I'm stationed here in Moorhead, Kentucky, in Rowan County, and my office is within the Northeastern District buildings with the Kentucky Division of Forestry.
And you are a wildlife biologist on public lands with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, but in addition to that, you are with the Kentucky chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation. And the American chestnut tree is the topic this hour, and we want to talk about that because how old do you have to be, Scott, to really remember an American chestnut tree in its heyday?
You would need to be 80 to 90 years old, probably, to really remember and appreciate the American chestnut tree in the forests of eastern Kentucky, because the blight, which attacked our American chestnut trees, is a fungus, and it arrived in Kentucky in the 1920s, was, already killing trees by the end of that decade and then into the 1930s as well.
We ought to talk about the history of this tree. How many different species of trees do Kentucky forests contain?
How many different species? It is incredibly diverse, and there are probably 25 trees, common trees, that make up the canopy, most of the canopy in Kentucky. As far as total number of trees, I believe it is much more than that. More than 25, although 25 is probably the common number.
And that's in forests. If you talk about trees from dogwood trees to apple trees to the oak trees in the forest across the state.
Then we're probably looking at least 100 species of trees and shrubs.
It's hard to nail that number down. So, given this, all right, this is the case. If you already have that many, do you really need one more? And where I'm going with that is we lost one a long time ago. You were saying the 1920s. We lost one, but the one that we lost, it was a doozy. It provided lumber. It provided mast for wild turkey and deer. And that one tree is the American chestnut tree. Can you give me the minute synopsis of what this tree meant to Kentucky and probably even more so Appalachia?
Yes, it was an incredibly important tree in the ecology of the forest as far as wildlife were concerned, but it was an incredibly important tree to the people of Kentucky as well because of like you mentioned, the lumber. It was used for multiple projects like barns and railroad ties and furniture and shingles on roofs, and it was extremely rot-resistant lumber. And it can still be found today, the lumber, in those old structures. It's still being recycled, I guess would be the right word, from old barns and old log cabins, and reused for new projects. And it has become, you may have heard the term wormy chestnut because of the physical characteristic of wormholes actually in the wood, and it gives it an interesting pattern that a lot of people appreciate today. And even out in the forest, you can still find stump rings, huge stump rings in the forest, just rings of rotted wood that kind of outline the base of where the tree used to be, that are 6 and 7 feet across. I've seen that in Letcher County in particular, and in Pike County I found one that was a good 6 feet across. And the reason I know they were chestnut stump rings is because there was a fresh stump sprout. A chestnut stump sprout was still visible. The leaves were on the sprout, so I knew that stump, that old stump that it had sprouted off of was actually an old American chestnut tree had been. And the benefits to wildlife we can't even begin to comprehend, I don't think, because nobody measured the impact of chestnuts prior to the blight fungus that killed all the big trees. However, there was some fascinating research done recently by some researchers at Ohio University. What they did was there's a stand of American chestnut trees in Wisconsin, which are actually outside the range of the American chestnut tree. That there weren't any chestnut trees there naturally before the blight struck, and it's believed that a pioneer who moved to Wisconsin, west to Wisconsin, took some nuts with him to plant when they finally settled in a new place, so there were 9 trees originally planted on this new farm in Wisconsin, and over the decades, nuts produced from those 9 original trees have established a new forest that comprises about 50 acres now, where the American chestnut tree is probably the most dominant tree, more so than the oaks and the hickories that are there. And the researchers at Ohio State University measured nut production in that forest, that chestnut forest, an American chestnut forest, and discovered that the trees there are producing approximately 400,000 nuts per acre.
That's a lot of nuts. Scott, can I say it? That's nuts.
That's incredible, yeah.
You had a story you wanted to tell me about how the American chestnut tree, and we'll get in more of the science of it in the next segment, but you had a story about how a chestnut tree saved someone's life? What was that?
Yes, it was a fascinating story related to me several years ago by a man in Breathitt County. And basically, the story he talked about was back in the 1800s here in Breathitt County, Kentucky, where his grandmother, when she was a little girl, she was out hunting with they were squirrel hunting with her father, and they had the family dog out there with them up in, on a ridge, a forested ridge in Breathitt County. This was back, in the 1800s when we still had bears and mountain lions. And, of course, the bears have made a comeback, but the mountain lions really aren't here yet. But back then, the mountain lions were still a part of the forest, and this mountain lion did attack, and the family dog, was the first line of defense.
Yeah.
And it tangled with this mountain lion, and his grandmother's father grabbed her, she was a little girl, and they actually jumped into the hollowed-out stump of a big American chestnut tree, such that it provided them protection. And he was actually able then to rest his gun on the stump of that tree and shoot the mountain lion from its protection. And that's just an amazing story.
That's a very large tree stump.
Yes. Yeah.
Scott, when we come back in the next segment, I want to talk to you about a story you and I did back in 2004 and try to pick up the story from there to see just how on track American chestnuts are in recovery efforts. Can you hang with us?
Oh, yes.
We are talking with Scott Freidhof. He is a forest manager. He's a public lands wildlife biologist, and we're talking about the American chestnut tree. My name is Charlie Baglan. You are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. My guest is in Moorhead, Kentucky today. This is Scott Freidhof. Scott is a public lands wildlife biologist, and he is one of the experts in the state on a tree that we have lost a century ago, the American chestnut tree, and gallant efforts are being made to bring it back. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Charlie.
I want to test your memory. It's back in 2004, you and I did a radio program called Kentucky Afield Radio. It was a 5-minute show back in the day, just a little short thing. And I want to play that for you, just to put in some perspective a little bit about the tree, what the plan was back in the day, and see just how on track plans still are for its recovery. Take a listen.
We go from what if to what now. The chestnut gets a second chance. Next on Kentucky Afield Radio. In our last report on the American chestnut, we wondered what might happen if the forest lost a tree. With the loss of the American chestnut tree in the 1920s and 30s, we got our answer. Its impact was more than anyone could have imagined. It meant the loss of a vital cash crop for many Appalachian families. The loss of its fruit meant the loss of wildlife, and the timber industry lost rich, plentiful wood. Disease didn't wipe the tree completely out, but stunted its growth to a spindly 15 or 20 feet, where in the past they loomed as high as 100 feet. Now in its place looms a challenge. Through science, can this once giant tree take a giant step forward?
It has an alternate host here, scarlet oak. It does not kill scarlet oak, but it manages to complete its life cycle and put out spores, so the blight will always be here. It'll never go away.
Rex Mann is president of the Kentucky chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation.
Our only hope is to breed up a tree resistant to the blight, and we're very close. If we can bring this thing back, and I believe we can, it will likely rank as one of the greatest restoration efforts in the history of this country.
The chestnut was once one of every 4 trees in the forest.
We've only found one tree here in Kentucky that was alive at the time of the blight, and it's still alive. It's a huge tree, about 40 inches in diameter, in Adair County.
For most of us, the American chestnut tree has little significance, so the idea of bringing it back may seem more the stuff of science fiction than ecological necessity, except for one time of year.
Chestnuts roasting on an open fire.
Chestnuts roasted in this popular carol are no longer the American chestnut, but are likely European, Italian, or the Chinese chestnut. And in addition to being a Christmas treat, the Chinese chestnut offers another gift.
They're trying to breed genetic resistance into our American chestnut trees by crossing them with the Chinese tree. And the Chinese chestnut shows the best blight resistance of all the chestnut trees worldwide because it has evolved over a longer period of time with this fungus.
Wildlife biologist Scott Freidhof describes the pollination process.
If you can drive a bucket truck up to a chestnut tree, that's great, because that is the easiest and best way to do it. It gives you access to all the parts of the canopy of the tree. However, we have some of our trees that are in very inaccessible places. In those situations, we've used Division of Forestry folks who will actually climb the chestnuts or climb an adjacent tree and reach over and grab the chestnut branches. And a tree in Letcher County, we used a 40-foot section of an old radio tower to get to the top of that tree.
We have established 3 seed orchards. One of these is on Robinson Forest. One is at Berea College, and the other is a place called the Home Place near Campbellsville. We have a research farm at Meadowview, Virginia. This is where we get our pollen.
Specialized pollen is sprinkled on the flowering buds in late spring, covered, and then left until early fall when the nuts are retrieved.
And this is a technique that has been used repeatedly for agricultural crops, but it's never been used for trees. But the principles are the same.
Crossbreeding the American and the Chinese began in 1989. Rex and Scott say the nuts from the fourth generation of this union should produce a disease-resistant tree with the same size and growth characteristics of our native chestnut.
Those trees that are going to produce the nuts that go back in the forest, they're actually in the ground right now. Nuts will be produced by the year 2007 that will be put back into the forest to restore the tree to eastern North America.
Once we get these trees into the main canopy, then they begin to take care of themselves. The squirrels will plant them, the blue jays will plant them. They grow like gangbusters. So as we put them in the forest, within 10 years, we would have a real good idea about whether or not our trees were going to make it.
Chestnuts will definitely be in our forest again, but not in the same density or distribution that they were originally. We lost the tree in a couple decades, but restoring it's going to take centuries, really.
In the meantime, we wait, fingers crossed, knowing all the while that even giant steps are small steps for where the tree needs to go.
Back live now. That was 2004, Scott. You heard your voice. You remember what you said. I want to take a few things point by point. Rex Mann, who was president of the chapter back then, he was with the U.S. Forest Service, right? The Winchester office?
That's correct. Uh-huh.
He said, we are very close. The plan is to breed up a tree that is resistant to the blight, and we are very close. Did that come to fruition?
Yes, actually, it has. Just 3 years after that interview with you, in 2007, the very first nuts were produced in orchards there at the research farms in Virginia of the American Chestnut Foundation that were planted back in the forest. And right now, in 2007 and since 2007, it has been a testing phase for these nuts. And the majority of those potentially blight-resistant nuts are going to the U.S. Forest Service for research plantings on the national forests in various states where researchers can measure survival of these trees on different sites and, sites that receive different treatments and then follow up with those. What has been discovered so far, although, it's only been a short time really since these trees were planted out, maybe 4 or 5 growing seasons at the most now since they've been planted, and more nuts are being produced each year.
Do they look like that they're growing the way you had anticipated?
No. I guess the answer is no. It's not quite exactly what we expected. Theoretically, all of the trees in this last generation were supposed to be blight resistant. However, what we're seeing is a range of blight resistance rather than all blight resistant. And the speculation that I'm aware of right now in the American Chestnut Foundation is that the blight-resistant genes from the Chinese parent aren't meshing up exactly the way they should in the American chestnut tree, so that our American chestnut restoration tree is not expressing full blight resistance like the Chinese parent. So actually a small percentage of these potentially blight-resistant trees that are being used in the test plantings are actually going to be blight resistant. And so the current plan to tighten up that number such that we get more trees produced that are blight resistant is to go to those orchards and reselect just those trees with the highest blight resistance that are producing the nuts and see if that will make more of the offspring blight resistant that will go back in the forest.
As scientists, you had to take into account this might work, it might not. There had to be a margin of error. Well, this should work. We'll put it in the ground and see if it does work. And if I hear you correctly, some of it is working, but not every seed from every group of parents, right?
That's correct, yeah. That is exactly what's going on. We're not seeing complete blight resistance as we expected. It's just just a percentage of the offspring are blight resistant.
I'm sure there's a term for this, but is the American Chestnut Foundation still very hopeful, optimistic with the results thus far, or is it really a setback?
No, I believe everybody is hopeful still. It is a setback that the scientists are working on right now to improve, and final results, it'll probably be another, it'll be 2015, maybe even 2020, until we have a really good handle on how to improve the percentage of offspring that are going to show blight resistance and be able to survive in the forest.
Scott, we got to get to a break. We don't mean to turn this into a biology lesson, but to try to keep it as down to earth and simple as we can. But I would like you to teach me, a novice, about how to crossbreed. When we come back in our next segment, I'm really curious about how do you crossbreed? How does that work? What if we were doing this with dogs or birds? But anyway, I'm sure a lot of the science is very similar. Hang with us. We're talking with public lands wildlife biologist Scott Freidhof, who is also the vice president of the Kentucky chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation. Scott is on the board of directors, and he knows his stuff when it comes to a tree that we lost called the American chestnut tree. We'll learn more when we come back after this. This is the Kentucky Afield Radio Network. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin, and I have the dubious distinction of having been in the business of communications as it applies to conservation since 1991. That's a bunch of years. Now, my mama used to ask me, Charles, what is it that you do? And I would say, I translate biology into English, and I try to make it interesting along the way. Because trust me, it can bore you to sleep in a heartbeat. Instantaneously, biology can bore you to tears, if not presented in the proper way. Now, we'll keep this in mind as we get to the root of just how foresters are breeding disease resistance into the American chestnut tree. That's our chat with Scott Freidhof as it continues, but first, this week's fishing report.
Hi, this is Kevin Fry with your Eastern Area Fisheries Report. Most successful fishing coming from visually locating bluegill on beds, while red ear are being caught on the bottom. Catfish reports are still good with chicken liver and various baits along shoreline. Some flatheads still being caught at Dewey Lake near shoreline. Largemouth bass fishing has really picked up at most all lakes. Where the water temperature is going up quickly now, look for better bass fishing at dusk or night in the clear water lakes. Crappie fishing, minnows, and tube jigs is still producing good catches of black and white crappie at Dewey Lake in shallow water. Look for the crappie in brush or suspended in open water near the brush. Also, the past week has produced some nice walleye at 10 pounds or better at Paintsville Lake. Fish being caught at night with night crawlers or crankbaits along weed bed edges.
Hi, this is Eric Cummins with your Southwest Kentucky Fishing Report. Barren River Lake, the water's well above summer pool, but is being dropped and pulled heavily by the Corps of Engineers. However, bass activity has been good over flooded bushes and vegetation with buzz baits, poppers, swim baits, and spinner baits. Crappie have been scattered, but best bets are near flooded willow trees and button bushes. At Green River Lake, bass are mainly in the post-spawn mode with fishing best on the secondary points and main lake drops. Muskie action has been good in 5 to 10 foot of water near cover with crankbaits, spinners, and topwaters. This is also an excellent time to hit some of our medium-sized streams like a Russell Creek, Little Barren, Gasper, or Red Rivers for spawning bass and rock bass. As always, good luck and good fishing. Be sure you wear your life jacket.
This is Jeff Crosby with the Central District Fishing Report. Currently, bluegill and shellcracker catches are excellent at many of our small public lakes, such as Beaver, Elmer, McNeely. These bluegill and shellcracker are being caught on a variety of baits, such as crickets, millworms, and redworms. A few blue cats are being taken at Taylorsville. These fish are being taken at about 8 to 25 feet of water. And finally, Black bass fishing at many of our district lakes, such as Taylorsville, Harrington, Gifts Creek, is currently good. Currently, points seem to be the biggest bass magnets for now, especially points close to the proximity of the river or creek channels. Crankbaits, spinnerbaits are productive baits, as well as plastics fished along shoreline covering 6 to 8 feet of water. So good luck, good fishing, and hope to see you on the water.
Thank you, gentlemen. My name's Charlie Baglin. You're in tune to Kentucky Afield Radio. Agriculture utilizes selective breeding and has done it very well for many years. The result is such things as shorter growing seasons, drought tolerance, more bountiful harvests, and disease resistance. Now, foresters are trying to breed a tree that Kentucky forests once had in abundance. And the goal is to breed in resistance to a disease that has all but wiped it out. We'll talk more about the American chestnut tree and the blight that is affecting it after the break.
Water competency. It's a term I think about on every mission. So should you, even if it's just a day on the lake.
Michael Noss, Navy SEAL.
Waves, currents, water temperature, being thrown overboard by sheer surprise, choking, a capsized boat. How confident are you then, no matter how well you swim? Accidents are never part of the plan, but wearing your life jacket should be.
Kentucky Fish and Wildlife reminds you your life jacket's got your back and the backing of the best swimmers everywhere.
You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin. Scott Freidhof is on the telephone with me, calling in from his office in Moorhead, Kentucky. That's in the Daniel Boone National Forest, and Scott is in forest management as well as a public lands wildlife biologist. The public lands, we'll just go ahead and mention, this is lands that the public can access. It's not your private acreage, your private farm. It's public lands. And Scott also serves with the Kentucky chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation. That's a mouthful. But the American chestnut tree used to be 1 in 4 trees in our forest. It was huge. It was quite the cash crop for its chestnuts that we enjoy over an open fire at Christmas time. It was quite the producer of lumber and timber and known for furniture and railroad ties, and the wood from this tree kept a lot of people going to the bank every week. Do I have that right, Scott?
Yes, absolutely. It was a great money maker in both lumber and for food. The people who lived in rural Appalachia could gather up the nuts and send them off to the big city and make money. It
still exists in Kentucky, despite the fact a blight came along, a disease that wiped the tree out. I guess you could talk about Dutch elm disease or the hemlock woolly adelgid, these wildlife diseases. It seems like every tree out there has something that is against it. But with the American chestnut tree, it was the blight, B-L-I-G-H-T, that has not wiped it out, but has stunted its growth. What will they be, 20 feet tall, 10 feet tall now versus 100 feet 100 years ago?
Yes, there really are millions of American chestnuts still in the forest, but they only exist now as small stump sprouts off of the original giants. And that is because the blight, they can live for so many years, and they don't live well in the forest understory, under all that shade of the big trees, but they hang on and they live for a few years, and then that stem will be reinfected with the blight fungus, and it'll die, but then fortunately it resprouts, and that's been going on for 80 years here in Kentucky and other Appalachian states, is this continual resprouting and death and resprouting, and that's why we still have so many American chestnut trees in our forest.
If you paid attention in biology class, and I know you did, Scott, to get a child of 2 parents that has certain traits. You've taken parent A, that's American chestnut, a parent B, and you're trying to get the child of those to have the trait to ward off the blight that has affected so many American chestnut trees. Let's say you have a white lab and a chocolate lab. Well, let's say you have the color white and the color black, and you put those together, and you get gray. Now, that much I know. But if you take the gray and then crossbreed it back with the black, you get something else. If you took the gray and you crossed it back to the white, you get something different still. How does that apply? Can you put these in? Let's recreate the American Chestnut Forest 101.
I will try to do that, Charlie. I got a C in my college genetics class, so I may not be the best person to talk about genetics, but it's for the work that I do in Kentucky with tree pollination. It's actually simple for what I do, but basically, American Chestnut Foundation breeding strategy is to breed blight resistance into our original American chestnut tree. And the best source of blight resistance is the Chinese chestnut tree.
Do the two trees look a lot alike anyway?
They do. I mean, if you look at them, there are 7 species of chestnut worldwide, and they all look like a chestnut tree. There's some leaf characteristics that are different between them and some twig characteristics that are different. Some of them, like our American chestnut tree was a very fast-growing and tall forest tree. It could really compete in the forest and grow fast and get up there in the canopy and be a dominant tree, whereas the Chinese chestnut tree, at least one of the Chinese chestnut tree species, was not. It wasn't quite as vigorous. It didn't have to always compete to get up in the canopy like our American tree did. So basically, all we want to take from that Chinese parent is blight resistance, and we want to keep all of our American chestnut tree characteristics so that it can once again compete in the forest here of eastern, our eastern North America.
Is that easier said than done?
Yes, as we're finding out, and that maybe the blight-resistant genes from the Chinese parent aren't lining up well with our American chestnut tree, such that our restoration American chestnut tree may not express the full blight resistance like the Chinese parent does. But as far as the actual practice in the field, it's really simple for me, where we bring just pollen from the male flower of a hybrid chestnut tree, and in this case, the research farms in Virginia already have the trees there where we can obtain the pollen. And the pollen we usually receive is about 7/8 American and only 1/8 Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And we bring that pollen over to Kentucky and basically take the female flowers on our Kentucky American tree, and we just dip it into the pollen and plant and male flower parts from the research trees in Virginia. And it's as simple as that, but we have to put a bag over our female flowers to make sure that no other pollen gets on those flowers and contaminates our sample. We want to make sure that the nuts we produce on our Kentucky American trees are the offspring that we want, which would be, if we bring 7/8 American pollen and put them on our pure American trees, the offspring are actually 15/16 American then. So that's what we're producing in Kentucky, are these 15/16 American trees and only 1/16 Chinese.
How can you be sure? And I ask because I don't know. If you are breeding Chinese chestnuts with American chestnuts, wouldn't everything that's Chinese go into that American chestnut? How do you know that you're just getting the part that's resistant to the blight? It seems like it's going on like a microscopic level. How do you know?
Yeah, it is quite a complex. We have to, when we create these 15/16 American nuts on our Kentucky American trees, we have to plant them in an orchard. We have to actually physically plant at least 100 nuts from each of our Kentucky trees into an orchard space where we can have easy access to them and care for them, water, fertilize, mow between the rows and all that. They have to be cared for. And in about 8 years, they reach a size where they're about 2 to 3 inches in diameter, and we purposely inoculate our trees with the fungus that kills them. And we do that usually in May or June, and we did this past, well, it was actually, I think, 2011, we actually treated that orchard at Robinson Forest, and and that was in late May, and we came back in November of 2011 and measured the size of the cankers on the bark, and basically the trees that had the smallest cankers are the trees that we keep to breed into the next generation. So we only chose 4 or 5 trees to keep out of that whole orchard, you know, from one Kentucky American tree that were produced. So very few trees actually make that cut to be used in the next stage of the breeding program. So it's based on the canker size. The smaller the canker, the better that tree's blight resistance.
Do you run
and it doesn't stop there. Then we came back in May of 2012 and made a final selection of those trees that showed good blight resistance. And that was basically just physical traits. We looked at the leaves and various aspects of the leaves, the twigs, and basically we chose those trees that showed the best American characteristics.
Do you run the risk, can you still hear me, Scott?
Yes. Do
you run the risk of, at 1/16th, if it goes to a 1/32nd and a 1/64th, that you breed the resistance back out of the tree?
No. There's always going to be a small percentage, you know, maybe only 5 or 6 trees out of 100 that will inherit all of the blight resistance from the Chinese parent way back down the line. You know, we know that we're going to get some that will inherit those blight-resistant genes.
We're talking with Scott Freidhof about the American Chestnut recovery effort. And Scott has been with this project for, I know, more than 20 years, right, Scott? He is on the board of directors and vice president of the Kentucky chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation, and is a wildlife biologist. He's with a public lands wildlife biologist, and very busy with forest management and quite the spokesman for it. Scott, we have one more segment. We'll try to wrap up and see what the plans look like for the future when we come back. Can you stay with me?
Yeah, I sure will.
My name is Charlie Baglan, and you are listening to the Kentucky Afield Radio Show. We're back again on Kentucky Afield Radio. I'm Charlie Baglan. I've been talking for this hour with Scott Freidhof, American Chestnut Tree Project. He's a coordinator with that. He's in charge of the pollination efforts and a wildlife biologist, and has been very instrumental in this effort. I want to say since it began, Scott, but I don't know if that's fair. I know that. How long have you been with the project?
Maybe 10 years now that I've been trying to assist in the restoration of the tree.
Everything in balance. In nature, there's a spot for everything, and when everything is in balance, the world is a lovely place. So let's put in perspective the American chestnut tree. So 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it was the king of the forest. And quite to the contrary, Paducah didn't exist. Lexington didn't exist. Yeah, as we know them today. Yeah. The cities that are there was room for the trees. There was room for all the wildlife that it fed. There was room for more deer and turkeys. And now that the tree has been gone, nature itself has sort of filled in the blanks and accommodated for the loss. And people have sort of accepted it. Now, if the tree comes back, it won't come back in the number of trees that we had when we lost the tree. But over time, would it not grow and put back the same mast, feed the same amount of wildlife that it did centuries past? And can the forest accommodate for the growth of the animal populations then? How's that all figure into this plan?
That's excellent questions about the future that mostly are unanswered, but the forest did fill in the gap that was created by the loss of the American chestnut tree, and here in Rowan County especially, but but other counties here in eastern Kentucky, what I've noticed is I see the chestnut stump sprouts still surviving in areas that now are dominated by scarlet oak and chestnut oak. The forest had trees there that were able to fill in that space. You know, of course, the oak trees produce acorns that feed a lot of wildlife, but definitely can't really even come close to the amount and the dependability of nuts that the American chestnut once produced.
So if if you have a tree, let's say the oak tree gets replaced by a chestnut tree, they're putting out, let's say, twice the amount of mast, and it feeds more deer, does that create more deer, more turkeys, more wildlife out there because there is more food?
You know, that's very possible. That is a possibility, and I've actually seen what mass production can do for wildlife, specifically when the American beech tree in our eastern forest has a bumper crop of nuts. It can really boost the numbers of wildlife populations in the forest, such as squirrels and ruffed grouse and chipmunks. You know, that I've actually seen the response from wildlife to a bumper crop of high-quality food that's available in large quantities. And I believe that it's very likely that the American chestnut tree, once it's back in our forest, is going to provide a large crop of quality food that will give wildlife populations a boost almost annually, because the chestnut tree can produce nuts on an annual basis, unlike our oaks and our beech. You know, our beech trees may only produce a bumper crop once every 8 years, whereas we can depend on the American chestnut tree to produce almost every year a really good crop of nuts.
It makes you feel good that you're a part of something worthwhile when you can restore something. I don't care if that's an old rocking chair that you have refinished in your basement, or if it is the return of the American bald eagle or a peregrine falcon, or the elk that are now in Kentucky, river otters. When you can restore something to the way it was and sort of right the wrongs of whatever happened back in the day to make these things go away, it makes you feel good. And I know you have to feel good about what you've done over the years with the American Chestnut Foundation. It hasn't gone exactly as planned. But if you could pick up a pair of binoculars, Scott, and look into the future 20 years, what would you expect to see?
Well, I would expect to see small pockets of American chestnut trees in the forest producing nuts that are going to be carried by squirrels and blue jays and people and be spread a little bit further into the forest every year. That eventually, you know, we're going to start out small. It'll still be small in 20 years, but it'll slowly expand back into the eastern forest, where we can begin to see true restoration of the American chestnut tree.
If anybody wants to know more about this plan, what's a good website?
The American Chestnut Foundation website is www.acf.org.
acf.org. Scott Freidhof, thanks for being. I've got one more question before we let you go, sir.
Okay.
Do you text and drive?
No.
This is Memorial Day weekend, the official start of the summer boating season, so, skipper, don't skip the life jackets. Your life jacket's got your back, and that is one of those exceptions where a catchy slogan and the God's honest truth are one and the same. Your life jacket's got your back. Next weekend in Kentucky, it's our annual free fishing weekend. What that means is no one needs a license to fish. Now, kids under 16 are exempt anyway, but now moms, dads, grandparents, aunts, uncles, they don't need a license that weekend either, June 1st and 2nd. Another thing I like about Free Fishing Weekend, visitors from out of state. They are not required to have a fishing license either. So next Saturday and Sunday, have at it. However, size and creel limits on number of fish that anglers may keep still apply, so obey the rules. You just do not need a license. If you like thinking about a place to go fishing, Kentucky's Urban Fishing Lakes, so that's also known as FINS, Fishing in Neighborhoods, They have 34 of these things scattered around Kentucky, and they're all pretty close to cities, and they are stocked and ready to rock. I want to make an angler out of you if I can, but more so, I want to turn you into a liar. If you go out next weekend and catch a fish, and it's 3 pounds, by the time you tell the story, when you get home, I implore you to double or triple that weight. Fishing is an opportunity to lie through your teeth, because usually the people that you're going to stretch the truth to aren't there to call you on it. I'm Charlie Baglin. Join us again in a week. We will go inside outdoors again right here on Kentucky Afield Radio.